What would you do if you had the skills to save your entire unit from deadly enemy snipers? But everyone dismissed you as just support staff? This is the story of Sophia Blake, and how one impossible shot in the mountains of Afghanistan changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Sentinel, nestled in the unforgiving mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The air was thin at 8,000 feet, sharp enough to cut through lungs unaccustomed to the altitude, and carried the perpetual scent of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the dust that seemed to coat everything in this forgotten corner of the world. Staff Sergeant Sophia Blake adjusted her kevlar helmet as she walked between the concrete barriers that formed the base's perimeter, her boots crunching on the gravel that served as their main thoroughfare. To anyone watching, Sophia looked like just another soldier going about routine duties. Her uniform bore the standard patches of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, and her equipment was regulation issue, nothing fancy, nothing that would distinguish her from the dozens of other service members who called FOB Sentinel home. What they couldn't see was the weight she carried that had nothing to do with her gear. At 26 years old, Sophia had been in the Army for 8 years, but for the past 2, she'd been assigned to what everyone politely called support duties. Communications specialist, they said. Radio maintenance and supply coordination. Essential work, they assured her, but everyone knew what it really meant. She was being kept away from the sharp end of operations, relegated to the background while the real soldiers handled the dangerous missions. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so frustrating. Before her reassignment, Sophia had been one of the most decorated marksmen in her previous unit. Her personnel file contained commendations for exceptional marksmanship, including a record that still stood at Fort Benning, a 2,100-meter confirmed hit during advanced sniper training. But that was before the incident in Helmand Province, before the investigation that cleared her of any wrongdoing, but somehow left her career in limbo. Blake! The voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Sergeant First Class David Crane stood outside the command bunker, his massive frame filling the doorway. At 6'4" and built like a linebacker, Crane commanded respect through sheer physical presence and a voice that could carry across a battlefield without electronic assistance. He'd been running operations at FOB Sentinel for 18 months. And in that time, he'd made his opinion of Sophia's assignment crystal clear. Yes, Sergeant. Sophia jogged over, automatically falling into the posture of attention that 8 years of military service had burned into her muscle memory. Crane looked down at her with the expression of a man who'd tasted something sour. Supply run to Outpost Delta got delayed. I need you to take inventory of the radio equipment in Building C and make sure everything's operational. We've got brass coming through next week, and I don't want any surprises. Roger that, Sergeant. Anything specific you want me to check for? Just make sure it all works, Blake. That's what you're here for, right? Technical stuff. His tone carried the subtle dismissal that had become routine over the past 2 years. Not cruel enough to be called harassment, but pointed enough to remind her exactly where she stood in the pecking order. As Sophia walked toward Building C, she caught sight of the 3 men who made up Precision Team Bravo, the base's elite sniper unit. Corporal Kevin Walsh was cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision of a man whose life depended on the weapon's reliability. Staff Sergeant Tom Mitchell and Private First Class Luke Bennett were studying topographical maps spread across a makeshift table, their conversation too low to overhear, but their body language suggesting intense concentration. These were the men who handled the high-value missions, the dangerous reconnaissance, the shots that mattered. Walsh had grown up hunting in Montana and could thread a needle at 800 meters. Mitchell was a former Marine Scout sniper with 2 tours in Iraq under his belt. Bennett was young but had proven himself in the mountains, adapting quickly to the unique challenges of high-altitude shooting. They were good. Sophia knew they were good. What frustrated her was that she was better, not that anyone cared to find out. The few times she'd attempted to share tactical observations or suggest improvements to their positioning, she'd been met with polite smiles and casual dismissals. "Thanks for the input, Blake, but we've got this covered. Maybe stick to what you know best, the radio stuff. We appreciate the enthusiasm, but leave the shooting to the shooters." Building C was a converted shipping container that had been reinforced with concrete and steel, transformed into a communications hub that connected Forward Sentinel to the larger network of bases throughout the region. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, their LED displays casting an eerie green glow in the dim interior. Sophia began her inspection methodically, checking connections, testing frequencies, and documenting serial numbers on her clipboard. The work was mind-numbing, but it gave her time to think. Through the single window, she could see the surrounding mountains that had become both prison and protection for the 200 soldiers stationed at Forward Sentinel. Those peaks rose like ancient sentinels, their snow-capped summits disappearing into clouds that seemed perpetually gray. Beautiful from a distance, but Sophia knew the reality. Every ridge could hide an enemy position, every valley could become a killing field, and every mission beyond the wire carried the risk of not coming home. It was while testing the long-range communications array that Sophia first noticed the pattern. Static on certain frequencies, interference that came and went in regular intervals. Most technicians would have dismissed it as atmospheric conditions or equipment wear, but Sophia's trained ear caught something else. The interference was too regular, too controlled. Someone was using radio discipline out there in the mountains, maintaining communication protocols that suggested military training. She made a note on her clipboard and continued working, but her mind was already shifting into a different mode. The same analytical thinking that had made her an exceptional marksman was now focused on the electronic signatures filtering through their communication network. Patterns within patterns, signals within static, stories told by the invisible. Electromagnetic spectrum that most people never bothered to read. By the time she finished the equipment check, Sophia had identified at least 3 distinct transmission sources operating in the mountains around Forward Sentinel. The signals were encrypted, professional, and coordinated in ways that suggested a level of organization rarely seen among local insurgent groups. This wasn't random harassment by village fighters with outdated weapons. This was something more sophisticated, more dangerous. She walked back to the command bunker with her clipboard full of routine maintenance notes and her head full of concerning patterns. Sergeant Crane was inside, studying aerial photographs with Lieutenant Davis, the base's operations officer. They looked up as she entered, their conversation pausing with the mild irritation of men interrupted during important work. "Equipment check complete, Sergeant," Sophia reported, handing over her clipboard. "Everything's operational, but I did notice some unusual radio traffic that might be worth investigating." Crane glanced at her notes without really reading them. "Unusual how?" "Coordinated transmissions from multiple sources in the surrounding mountains. The encryption pattern suggests military-grade equipment, and the timing indicates they're conducting organized surveillance of our operations." Lieutenant Davis, a young officer fresh from West Point with more enthusiasm than experience, looked up from his photographs. "Are you suggesting we have organized enemy forces conducting reconnaissance?" "I'm saying the radio signatures indicate a level of coordination and equipment that suggests we're not dealing with random insurgent activity. This looks like preparation for something larger." Crane set down her clipboard without finishing it. "Blake, you're a communications technician, not an intelligence analyst. Radio static doesn't make you qualified to assess enemy capabilities." "But Sergeant, the patterns are clear if you look at the frequency analysis. Blake." His voice carried The finality of command authority. I need you to focus on your actual job. Make sure our radios work when we need them to work. Leave the tactical analysis to people who are trained for it. Sophia felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. Yes, Sergeant. Understood. As she left the command bunker, she could hear Davis asking Crane about the radio signatures. Think there's anything to what she said? Crane's response was barely audible but carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Davis, that woman sees conspiracies in her breakfast cereal. She's been trying to get back into operation since she got here, and she say anything to make herself look important. The day I start taking tactical advice from the radio repair girl is the day I turn in my stripes. The words hit harder than Sophia expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were so casually dismissive. 2 years of proving her competence, 2 years of professional performance, 2 years of watching from the sidelines while less qualified people made decisions that affected everyone's safety. And in the end, she was still just the radio repair girl to them. But as Sophia walked back to her quarters, her mind was already working on a different problem. The radio signatures she detected weren't random, and they weren't going away. Whatever was building in those mountains was bigger than routine insurgent harassment. The pattern suggested coordination, planning, and resources that could pose a serious threat to everyone at Forward Sentinel. She might be just support, but she was support with skills that could keep people alive. The question was whether anyone would listen before it was too late. The evening briefing would prove that they wouldn't. The evening briefing was held in the same converted shipping container that served as FOB Sentinel's command center, its steel walls lined with maps, communication equipment, and the kind of motivational posters that looked increasingly ironic. As tours dragged on, Sophia sat in the back row with the other support personnel, technically present, but effectively invisible to the officers conducting the briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Pierce stood at the front of the room, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had somehow maintained its precision despite 3 months in the mountains. Pierce was old-school Army, a career officer who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics, and her presence at FOB Sentinel meant this briefing carried weight beyond routine operations. Gentlemen, Pierce began, her voice carrying the authority of 23 years in uniform. Intelligence indicates increased insurgent activity in our area of operations. Satellite imagery shows movement in the northern valleys, and communication intercepts suggest coordination between previously independent groups. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. This aligned perfectly with the radio signatures she detected during her equipment check, but she noticed that none of her analysis had made it into the official briefing. Crane sat 2 rows ahead, his attention focused on Pierce's presentation, apparently having dismissed Sophia's observations as thoroughly as he dismissed her concerns. Our mission remains unchanged, Pierce continued, clicking to the next slide. Maintain security for supply convoys using Highway 7, provide overwatch for reconstruction efforts in the valley settlements, and gather intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. What's changing is the threat level. Staff Sergeant Mitchell raised his hand. Ma'am, Precision Team Bravo has been conducting reconnaissance sweeps for the past month. We haven't observed the kind of organized activity that would suggest coordinated insurgent operations. That's exactly the problem, Sergeant, Pierce replied. The fact that you haven't observed it doesn't mean it's not happening. Professional. Insurgent operations are characterized by their ability to remain invisible until they choose to reveal themselves. Sophia could feel the tension in the room shift. These were men accustomed to confidence in their abilities, and Pierce's implication that they might have missed something significant didn't sit well with the assembled soldiers. Corporal Walsh shifted in his seat, his jaw tight with barely contained irritation. Ma'am, Walsh interjected, with respect, Precision Team Bravo has eyes on every major approach to this base. We've logged over 400 hours of observation time in the past month. If there were organized enemy forces operating in our area, we would have detected them." Pierce studied Walsh for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Corporal, how many enemy snipers would you estimate are currently operating within effective range of this base?" Walsh glanced at Mitchell before answering. "Based on our reconnaissance and the terrain analysis, probably none, ma'am. The approaches that would allow effective long-range engagement are under constant observation. We'd spot enemy snipers before they could establish effective positions." "I see." Pierce clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed topographical map of the surrounding mountains. Red circles marked elevated positions that offered clear lines of sight to FOB Sentinel. According to this analysis conducted by the 75th Ranger Regiment's reconnaissance specialists, there are at least 12 positions within 1,500 meters that could support effective sniper operations against this base. The room fell silent. Sophia counted the red circles on the map and felt her stomach tighten. 12 positions, all of them offering clear shots at the base's critical infrastructure, vehicle parking areas, and personnel movement corridors. If even half of those positions were occupied by competent snipers, FOB Sentinel would become a killing field the moment hostilities began. Furthermore, Pierce continued, communication intercepts suggest that enemy forces have been conducting detailed surveillance of our operations for at least 6 weeks. They know our patrol schedules, our supply convoy timing, and our personnel movement patterns. Sergeant Crane stood up, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. If I may, our security protocols are comprehensive. We rotate patrol times, vary convoy routes, and maintain irregular schedules for all non-essential movement. Sergeant, when was the last time you varied the timing of your morning formation?" Crane opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The morning formation happened at 0630 every day, without exception. It was one of those military traditions that provided structure and routine, but also predictability that any competent observer could exploit. "When was the last time you altered the route of your perimeter patrols?" Again, silence. "The perimeter patrols followed the same basic pattern every day, modified only by weather conditions or specific intelligence threats." "When was the last time you changed the location of your communications equipment?" Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Building C, where she'd spent the morning conducting equipment checks, was in the same location it had occupied for 18 months. Any observer with basic military training would have identified it as a critical target within days of establishing surveillance. Pierce let the questions hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Gentlemen, predictability is the enemy of security. The moment we become comfortable with our routines is the moment we become vulnerable to anyone patient enough to study those routines." Lieutenant Davis raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what specific changes are you recommending?" "First, immediate implementation of irregular schedules for all routine operations. Second, enhanced counter-surveillance measures including random observation sweeps of all potential sniper positions. Third, comprehensive review of all communication security protocols." Pierce paused and looked directly at Sophia for the first time during the briefing. "I understand we have personnel with relevant expertise in signal analysis and long-range reconnaissance. I want all available resources utilized in assessing our current vulnerabilities." Sophia felt every head in the room turn toward her, but the expressions weren't encouraging. Crane's face had gone from flushed to pale, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. Being publicly identified as having relevant expertise put him in an impossible position: ignore her capabilities and risk Pierce's displeasure, or acknowledge her skills and admit he'd been wasting valuable resources for 2 years. "Ma'am," Crane said carefully, "Staff Sergeant Blake has been handling our communications maintenance and has identified some irregular radio traffic in the area." "Irregular how?" Sophia felt the weight of Pierce's attention like a physical force. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the chance to contribute meaningfully to operations instead of sitting on the sidelines. But she could also feel the hostility radiating from her male colleagues, their resentment at having their competence questioned by an outside authority figure, and their reluctance to accept that she might have insights they'd missed. "Ma'am," Sophia said, standing up from her position in the back row, "I've detected coordinated radio transmissions from multiple sources in the surrounding mountains. The encryption patterns and timing suggest military-grade equipment and professional communication discipline. Based on the signal strength and frequency analysis, I estimate at least 3 separate units operating within a 15-kilometer radius of our position." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia could hear the ventilation system humming, the distant sound of a generator running, and the rapid beating of her own heart. Pierce studied her with the intense focus of a professional soldier evaluating new intelligence. 3 separate units, Pierce repeated. "How long have you been monitoring these transmissions?" "I first detected the pattern this morning during routine equipment maintenance, but reviewing our logs, similar signatures have been present for at least 10 days. And this information was reported through proper channels?" Sophia glanced at Crane, whose face had gone completely white. "I brought my concerns to Sergeant Crane earlier today." Pierce's gaze shifted to Crane with the precision of a targeting laser. "Sergeant, why wasn't this information included in today's intelligence briefing?" Crane stood frozen for a moment, caught between acknowledging his mistake and defending his previous dismissal of Sophia's analysis. "Ma'am, The initial assessment suggested the signals might be atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. I wanted to conduct further analysis before including it in official reporting." "I see." Pierce's tone suggested she saw considerably more than Crane was comfortable with. "Staff Sergeant Blake, I want a complete analysis of these radio signatures on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. Include signal strength data, frequency patterns, estimated locations, and your assessment of enemy capabilities based on the equipment signatures." "Yes, ma'am." "Furthermore, I want you to work directly with Precision Team Bravo to identify optimal observation positions for counter-surveillance operations. Your signal analysis combined with their field experience should provide comprehensive coverage of potential enemy positions." Sophia felt a surge of professional satisfaction mixed with apprehension. This was the assignment she'd been hoping for, the chance to use her skills in a meaningful way. But she could also feel the waves of resentment from Walsh, Mitchell, and Bennett. Being forced to work with the radio repair girl wasn't going to improve their opinion of her capabilities. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his voice carefully controlled, "Precision Team Bravo has been operating effectively without additional personnel. Adding support staff to field operations could compromise operational security and team cohesion." Pierce's expression hardened slightly. "Sergeant, are you suggesting that utilizing all available expertise is detrimental to mission effectiveness?" "No, ma'am. I'm suggesting that field operations require specific training and experience that can't be replaced by technical knowledge." "I see. Staff Sergeant Blake, what's your background in field reconnaissance?" Sophia took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine whether she spent the next few months proving herself or returning to radio maintenance duty. "Ma'am, before my assignment to communications, I served 18 months with the 3rd Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Platoon. I have over 200 hours of field observation time and advanced training in long-range surveillance techniques." The room erupted in whispered conversations. This was information that none of her current colleagues possessed, and their surprise was evident in their expressions. Pierce raised her hand for silence. "Furthermore," Sophia continued, "I hold expert marksmanship qualifications on all standard infantry weapons and have completed advanced sniper training at Fort Benning." The whispers stopped entirely. Walsh, Mitchell, and Bennett were staring at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to grudging curiosity. Even Crane looked like he was seeing her for the first time. Pierce nodded slowly. "Thank you for that clarification, Staff Sergeant. I think we have a much clearer picture of our available resources now." As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out of the command center, Sophia could feel the shift in atmosphere. She was no longer invisible, but she wasn't sure that visibility was going to make her life any easier. The resentment she'd sensed from her male colleagues had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous: professional jealousy mixed with wounded pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new ways for things to go catastrophically wrong. But for the first time in 2 years, Sophia Blake felt like she might actually get the chance to do the job she'd trained for. The mountains around Forward Sentinel held secrets, and she was finally going to help uncover them. Dawn at FOB Sentinel came with the sharp clarity that only existed at high altitude, where the thin air seemed to magnify every detail of the surrounding landscape. Sophia stood at her workstation in Building C, surrounded by banks of radio equipment and computer screens displaying signal analysis data that most people would dismiss as electronic noise. But to her trained eye, the patterns were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly ominous. She'd been awake since 0400, analyzing 3 days' worth of intercepted radio traffic, building a comprehensive picture of enemy communications that painted a disturbing portrait of coordination and planning. The encrypted transmissions she'd first detected were just the surface layer of a much deeper network. Beneath the obvious military communications were subtle patterns, timing variations, frequency shifts, and signal strength fluctuations that suggested a level of operational security that belonged to professional military units, not village insurgents with rifles and improvised explosives. The door to Building C opened with the metallic screech of hinges that desperately needed oil, and Staff Sergeant Mitchell entered with the deliberate casualness of a man trying to assert dominance in an unfamiliar situation. Tom Mitchell was 32 years old, built like a marathon runner, and possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from 5 years of successful sniper operations. His presence in Sophia's domain represented the first concrete step in their forced collaboration, and neither of them was entirely comfortable with the arrangement. "Blake," he said, nodding toward her workstation, "Pierce wants a joint briefing on enemy positions at 0800. You ready to show us what you've got?" Sophia gestured toward the multiple screens displaying her analysis. "I've identified 17 distinct radio signatures operating in coordinated patterns around our position. The interesting thing isn't what they're saying, most of it's encrypted, but how they're saying it." Mitchell moved closer to the displays, his expression skeptical but attentive. As a Marine veteran, he understood the importance of intelligence gathering, even if he wasn't entirely convinced that a communications specialist could provide insights that his team had missed during months of field observation. "Explain how they're saying it," he said. Sophia pulled up a frequency analysis chart that looked like a complex musical score, with peaks and valleys representing different types of radio activity. Professional military units maintain communication discipline. They use specific protocols for check-ins, emergency signals, and operational updates. These transmissions follow textbook patterns for coordinated surveillance operations. She pointed to a series of regular spikes on the chart. Every 6 hours, at exactly the same intervals, we get brief transmissions from all 17 sources. Duration is consistent. Signal strength suggests they're maintaining the same positions, and the timing indicates centralized command coordination. Mitchell studied the data, his skepticism beginning to transform into professional interest. "You're saying they're conducting organized surveillance with military-grade communication discipline." "I'm saying they're not random insurgents taking potshots at our patrols. This is systematic intelligence gathering by people who understand how to remain invisible while collecting detailed information about our operations. The door opened again, and Corporal Walsh entered with Private Bennett close behind. Kevin Walsh was everything that popular culture expected from a military sniper: tall, lean, and possessed of the kind of preternatural calm that allowed him to remain motionless for hours while waiting for the perfect shot. Luke Bennett, at 23, was the team's newest member, but his adaptation to mountain warfare had been impressive enough to earn respect from veterans twice his age. "Mitchell, we've got movement in Sector 7, Walsh reported. Bennett spotted what looked like equipment caches being moved in the northern valley. Could be preparation for something bigger. Sophia looked up from her screens. What time was this movement observed? Bennett checked his notes. Approximately 0530, just before dawn. Sophia pulled up her transmission logs and highlighted a cluster of radio activity that had occurred at P. 525. 5 minutes before you observed the movement, I detected coordinated communications between sources 3, 7, and 12. Short duration, high intensity, followed by complete radio silence. The three men exchanged glances that carried the weight of professional recognition. This wasn't coincidence, it was evidence of coordination between ground observation and radio intelligence that none of them had expected from their communications specialist. "Show us the source locations," Walsh said, his tone losing its casual dismissiveness. Sophia overlaid her signal analysis data onto a topographical map of the surrounding mountains. Red dots appeared at 17 different locations, each representing a radio source that had been consistently active for at least 3 days. The pattern that emerged was tactically sophisticated: a ring of observation posts positioned to provide comprehensive coverage of LB Sentinel's approaches, with overlapping fields of observation that would make it nearly impossible for military operations to occur without detection. "Jesus," Bennett muttered. "They've got us completely surrounded." "It gets worse," Sophia said, highlighting 3 specific positions on the map. Sources 3, 9, and 14 are positioned at optimal sniper ranges from our main compound. If these positions are occupied by competent marksmen with quality equipment, they could effectively control all movement within the base perimeter. Mitchell leaned over the map, his expression grim. "These positions, we've observed them during our reconnaissance sweeps. No activity, no signs of occupation." "When was your last observation?" "Sector 9 was covered yesterday afternoon. Sector 3 2 days ago. Sector 14 ... double quotes." Mitchell paused, checking his logs. 4 days ago. Sophia pulled up her radio traffic analysis. Source 14 has been active every 6 hours for the past 72 hours. Either they're very good at concealment, or they're using positions you haven't discovered yet. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. If enemy forces had been maintaining surveillance positions for days without detection by Precision Team Bravo, it suggested either that the enemy possessed exceptional fieldcraft skills, or that the sniper team's reconnaissance methods were inadequate. For the current threat level. Walsh broke the uncomfortable silence. "Could be dead drops. Radio equipment hidden in cache sites, operated remotely." "Possible," Sophia agreed, "but the signal patterns suggest real-time operation. The timing variations and frequency adjustments indicate human operators responding to changing conditions, not automated equipment following preset programs." Bennett studied the map with the intense focus of a young soldier, trying to understand how professional adversaries had gained such comprehensive advantage. If they've had us under observation for weeks, they know everything about our operations. Patrol schedules, guard rotations, supply convoy timing, everything. "That's exactly what Pierce was warning us about yesterday," Mitchell said grimly. "Predictability creates vulnerability." Sophia highlighted another section of her analysis. "There's something else." The communication pattern suggests they're preparing for a coordinated operation. Over the past 12 hours, radio traffic has increased by 40%, and the signals are becoming more frequent and more urgent. Define. Urgent, Walsh said. Shorter transmissions, tighter scheduling, and frequency variations that suggest operational rather than surveillance communications. These aren't people conducting routine observation. They're people preparing to act. The door to building C opened once more, and Sergeant Crane entered with the expression of a man who'd spent the night reconsidering his career choices. The previous evening's briefing had made it clear that his dismissal of Sophia's intelligence had embarrassed him in front of senior leadership, and his attitude toward her had shifted from casual dismissiveness to careful professional courtesy. Blake, Pierce wants your analysis integrated with the morning intelligence briefing. She specifically requested that you present your findings directly to the command staff. Sophia felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and apprehension. This was the opportunity she'd been seeking for 2 years, the chance to contribute meaningfully to operational planning. But it also meant putting her reputation on the line in front of officers who would judge her competence based on a single presentation. Roger that, Sergeant. I'll have the complete analysis ready in 30 minutes. Crane nodded, then turned to Mitchell. Tom, Pierce also wants Precision Team Bravo to provide field verification of Blake's source locations. She's authorizing immediate reconnaissance sweeps of all suspected positions. Mitchell looked at the map with its 17 red dots representing potential enemy positions. That's a lot of ground to cover, especially if these positions are occupied by people who don't want to be found. Then you'd better be good at finding them, Crane said. Because if Blake's analysis is accurate, we're looking at the most serious threat this base has faced since establishment. As the meeting broke up and personnel began preparing for their respective missions, Sophia felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her analysis had moved from theoretical exercise to operational intelligence, and people's lives would depend on the accuracy of her conclusions. The radio equipment around her hummed with electronic activity, capturing invisible conversations that might determine whether Forward Sentinel remained a secure military installation or became a target for coordinated enemy action somewhere in the mountains. People were preparing for something that would test every assumption about security and capability that the base's personnel had developed over 18 months of routine operations. And for the first time since arriving at Forward Sentinel, Sophia Blake felt like she was exactly where she belonged, at the center of intelligence operations that might determine whether her fellow soldiers lived or died in the coming days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0800, but by 0745, the command center had transformed into a hub of urgent activity that suggested routine intelligence sharing was about to become crisis management. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce stood at the center of it all, her silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light as she studied multiple intelligence reports that had apparently arrived during the night. The tension in the room was palpable, crackling with the kind of energy that preceded significant military operations. Sophia entered the converted shipping container carrying her laptop and a folder containing printed analysis charts, graphs, and topographical overlays that represented 3 days of intensive signal intelligence work. For the first time since arriving at Forward Sentinel, she was walking into a briefing as a primary presenter rather than an invisible observer, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any equipment she'd ever carried. Staff Sergeant Blake, Pierce acknowledged as Sophia took her position near the front of the room. Before we begin your presentation, I need to share some developments that occurred overnight. Pierce clicked to her first slide, which showed satellite imagery of the northern valley approaches to Forward Sentinel. Even to untrained eyes, The images revealed obvious signs of organized activity: vehicle tracks, equipment staging areas, and what appeared to be prepared fighting positions carved into the mountainside. At approximately 0200 this morning, satellite surveillance detected significant movement in sectors corresponding to several of the radio source locations that Staff Sergeant Blake identified in her preliminary analysis. What we're looking at represents the largest concentration of organized enemy forces observed in this region since the establishment of Forward Sentinel. The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of helicopters conducting routine patrol flights. Sophia studied the satellite images with growing apprehension, recognizing locations that corresponded exactly to radio sources she'd been tracking for days. The correlation between her signal intelligence and visual confirmation was both professionally satisfying and personally terrifying. Staff Sergeant Mitchell raised his hand. "Ma'am, how many personnel are we estimating?" Conservative estimates suggest between 40 and 60 combatants distributed across multiple positions. However, the level of coordination and the sophistication of their preparation suggest we're dealing with experienced fighters rather than local insurgents. Pierce clicked to the next slide, which showed intercepted communications traffic over the past 24 hours. The electronic signatures that Sophia had been analyzing were displayed as peaks and valleys on a frequency chart, but now they told a story of escalating activity that looked like preparation for imminent action. Staff Sergeant Blake's analysis indicates a significant increase in radio traffic, beginning at approximately 2,200 last night. The pattern suggests coordination for a major operation scheduled to begin within the next 12 to 18 hours. Corporal Walsh leaned forward in his seat. "Ma'am, what type of operation are we looking at? Direct assault, indirect fire, or harassment?" Pierce looked directly at Sophia. "Staff Sergeant, based on your signal analysis and the positioning of identified enemy forces, what's your assessment of their most likely course of action?" This was the moment Sophia had been preparing for since she first detected the unusual radio patterns. Her analysis wasn't just academic exercise anymore. It was operational intelligence that would determine how FOB Sentinel prepared for potentially the most dangerous threat it had faced since establishment. "Ma'am," Sophia began, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Based on the positioning of radio sources and the correlation with satellite imagery, I believe we're looking at a coordinated sniper operation designed to paralyze base operations rather than conduct a direct assault." She pulled up her tactical analysis overlay, which showed Forward Sentinel surrounded by the 17 enemy positions she'd identified. Red lines extended from each position, representing optimal lines of sight for long-range engagement of critical base infrastructure. The positioning is tactically sophisticated. These aren't random harassment positions. They're calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire that would make it extremely dangerous for personnel to move between buildings, conduct vehicle operations, or maintain normal base functions. Lieutenant Davis studied the overlay with obvious concern. "You're suggesting they intend to conduct a siege operation using snipers positioned around our perimeter?" "More than that, sir. The communication pattern suggests they're planning to initiate their operation during our morning formation, when personnel density is highest and movement patterns are most predictable. Maximum psychological impact with maximum casualty potential." The implications of Sophia's analysis settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Morning formation occurred every day at 0630, with nearly 200 personnel assembled in the central courtyard of FOB Sentinel. If enemy snipers opened fire during that formation, the casualties could be catastrophic, and the psychological impact could effectively end the base's operational capability. Pierce nodded grimly. "How confident are you in this assessment, Staff Sergeant?" "Ma'am, the radio traffic patterns over the past 12 hours show classic preparation signatures for coordinated action. Increased frequency of communications, shorter transmission duration, and timing that suggests final coordination for an operation scheduled to begin at dawn. Sergeant Crane, who had been notably quiet since the previous evening's briefing, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, if Blake's analysis is accurate, we need to immediately alter our formation schedule and implement enhanced security protocols." "Already." "Done, Sergeant. Morning formation has been canceled indefinitely, and all non-essential personnel movement has been restricted. The question now is how we respond to a threat that appears to have comprehensive intelligence about our operations." Staff Sergeant Mitchell raised his hand. "Ma'am, Precision Team Bravo requests permission to conduct immediate counter-sniper operations. If we can identify and eliminate these positions before they initiate their operation, we can neutralize the threat." Pierce studied the tactical overlay showing 17 potential enemy positions scattered across several square kilometers of mountainous terrain. "Sergeant, you're talking about simultaneous operations against multiple targets across terrain that heavily favors defensive positions. Even with perfect intelligence, the logistics of coordinating that many engagements would be extremely challenging." "Ma'am, that's what we're trained for. Precision Team Bravo has conducted successful operations against fortified positions before." Sophia looked at the map with growing concern. Her signal analysis had provided locations for enemy radio sources, but our ADIO equipment could be positioned away from actual sniper positions. Worse, the sophisticated communication discipline she'd observed suggested these weren't ordinary insurgents. They were professionals who understood counter-sniper tactics and would have prepared for exactly the kind of response that Mitchell was proposing. "Ma'am," Sophia interjected, "I need to point out that the radio sources I've identified might not correspond directly to sniper positions. Professional operators would separate their communication equipment from their firing positions to prevent exactly the kind of triangulation that we're attempting." Mitchell turned toward her with barely concealed irritation. "Blake, we appreciate the intelligence work, but field operations require different expertise than signal analysis. We know how to find and eliminate enemy snipers. I'm not questioning your field expertise, Sergeant. I'm suggesting that these particular enemies have demonstrated levels of operational security that indicate professional military training. They've been observing our operations for weeks without detection, which means they understand our capabilities and limitations." The tension between Sophia's analytical approach and Mitchell's operational confidence was becoming palpable. She represented theoretical knowledge derived from electronic signatures, while he represented practical experience gained through successful combat operations. Both approaches had value, but they were leading to fundamentally different conclusions about how to respond to the emerging threat. Pierce raised her hand for silence. "The reality is that we're facing a coordinated threat from professional adversaries who have been preparing this operation for weeks. Conventional counter-sniper tactics may not be sufficient." She clicked to a new slide showing the base's defensive positions and escape routes. "Therefore, we're implementing a comprehensive defensive posture. All personnel will remain in hardened positions. Vehicle movement will be restricted to armored assets only, and all external operations are suspended until this threat is neutralized." Private Bennett, who had been quietly studying the tactical overlay, spoke up for the first time during the briefing. "Ma'am, if we're correct about their timeline, they're planning to initiate operations in approximately 6 hours. Defensive posture might keep us alive, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem," explained Private. "Ma'am, if enemy snipers can effectively control movement within our base perimeter, they don't need to cause massive casualties to achieve their objective. They just need to demonstrate that we can't maintain normal operations. That kind of psychological victory could undermine our entire mission in this region." Sophia nodded, recognizing the strategic implications that Bennett had identified. "He's right, ma'am. Successful sniper operations aren't measured by body count. They're measured by their ability to paralyze enemy operations through fear and uncertainty. Pierce looked around the room at the assembled personnel, each representing different aspects of FOB Sentinel's defensive capability. Then we need a solution that goes beyond passive defense. The question is whether we can identify and neutralize these threats before they have the opportunity to demonstrate their capability. As the briefing continued with discussions of defensive positions, communication protocols, and emergency procedures, Sophia felt a growing sense of foreboding. Her analysis had provided crucial intelligence about the emerging threat, but intelligence alone couldn't solve the tactical problem they were facing. Somewhere in the mountains surrounding FOB Sentinel, professional adversaries were making final preparations for an operation that could transform a secure military installation into a psychological battleground. And despite all their preparation, training, and technology, the defenders were still struggling to develop an effective response. Morning sun was climbing higher over the Nevada desert, and time was running out. By 1100 hours, FOB Sentinel had transformed from a routine military installation into a fortress under siege. Concrete barriers had been repositioned to create additional cover. Vehicle movement had been restricted to armored Humvees only, and personnel moved between buildings in short sprints that looked more like urban warfare tactics than normal base operations. The atmosphere was tense with the kind of anticipation that preceded either decisive action or catastrophic failure. Precision Team Bravo had deployed at 0900 with a mission that looked straightforward on paper, but was proving nearly impossible. In execution, their objective was to locate and neutralize the enemy sniper positions that Sophia's intelligence had identified, using coordinated overwatch positions to provide mutual support while systematically clearing each suspected location. It was textbook counter-sniper doctrine, executed by some of the most competent marksmen in the U.S. military. 3 hours later, they had nothing to show for their efforts except frustration and growing respect for their adversaries' professional capabilities. Sophia monitored their progress from Building C, listening to radio communications that painted a picture of tactical sophistication that none of them had anticipated. The enemy forces weren't simply occupying fixed positions and waiting for targets. They were conducting active counter-surveillance, using decoy positions, and demonstrating fieldcraft skills that belonged to elite military units rather than regional insurgents. Overwatch 2, this is Overwatch 1. Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained frustration. I've got eyes on suspected position 7. No movement, no heat signatures, no evidence of recent occupation. Site appears clean. Roger. Overwatch 1. Overwatch 3 reports similar findings at position 12. Either these guys are ghosts or they're using locations we haven't identified yet. Sophia studied her signal analysis display, watching real-time radio traffic that told a different story than the field reports she was hearing. Enemy communications were continuing from the same source locations that Precision Team Bravo was reporting as unoccupied, which meant either her analysis was wrong or the enemy was using remote communication equipment to maintain operational security. Overwatch 1. This is Base Command. Pierce's voice cut through the tactical chatter. What's your assessment of enemy presence in your sector? Ma'am, we've observed 3 of the suspected positions identified by signal intelligence. All locations show evidence of recent activity, disturbed vegetation, equipment caches, prepared fighting positions, but no current enemy presence. It's like they knew we were coming. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Professional military units maintained sophisticated communication networks precisely because they understood the importance of operational intelligence. If the enemy had been monitoring FOB Sentinel's communications, they would have known about the counter-sniper operation before Precision Team Bravo ever left the base perimeter. She switched her radio to the command frequency. Base Command, this is Blake. Request permission to speak. Go ahead, Blake. Ma'am, enemy radio traffic indicates they're tracking our counter-sniper teams in real time. They're conducting tactical displacement to avoid engagement while maintaining operational capability. The silence that followed suggested everyone was processing the implications of what Sophia had just reported. If the enemy could monitor their operations and adjust their positions accordingly, conventional counter-sniper tactics would be essentially useless. Worse, it meant that Precision Team Bravo was operating in an environment where their adversaries possessed comprehensive situational awareness while they were working with incomplete intelligence. Blake, can you provide specific intelligence on enemy movements? Pierce asked. Sophia studied her displays, watching radio traffic patterns that showed coordinated movement between multiple positions. Ma'am, based on communication timing and signal strength variations, I'm tracking active displacement of at least 6 enemy elements. They're maintaining defensive positions while avoiding our search areas. Overwatch 1, did you copy that transmission? Roger, Base Command, we copy. Request guidance on modified search patterns. Pierce's response carried the weight of a commander, realizing that her tactical assumptions had been fundamentally incorrect. Overwatch 1, enemy forces appear to possess real-time intelligence on your movements. Conventional search patterns are ineffective under these conditions. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's voice returned with professional frustration that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Ma'am, are you ordering us to abort the mission? The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal flare. Aborting the counter-sniper operation would leave FOB Sentinel vulnerable to coordinated sniper attacks, while acknowledging that conventional military tactics were insufficient against these particular adversaries. But continuing the operation, with compromised intelligence and enemy forces that could anticipate their movements, was equally problematic. Corporal Walsh's voice crackled through the radio with urgent intensity. All stations, this is Overwatch 2. I've got movement in Sector 9, approximately 800 meters north of suspected position 14. Single individual with what appears to be military-grade optical equipment. Overwatch 2, can you engage? Negative. Target is using terrain for concealment, and I don't have a clear shot. But he's definitely conducting surveillance of our operations. Sophia pulled up her tactical display and marked the location Walsh had identified. According to her signal analysis, radio source 14 had been active from that general area for 3 days, but the specific location Walsh was reporting was approximately 200 meters from where her triangulation had placed the transmission source. Base Command, this is Blake. The observation position Overwatch 2 identified is offset from the radio source location, which suggests sophisticated operational security. They're separating observation positions from communication equipment. Meaning? What, exactly? Pierce asked. Ma'am, it means they understand counterintelligence tactics well enough to prevent us from using signal analysis to target their actual fighting positions. We've been tracking their radios, not their snipers. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Sophia's intelligence work had provided accurate information about enemy communication networks, but those networks had been deliberately designed to mislead exactly the kind of analysis she'd been conducting. The enemy wasn't just professional, they were sophisticated enough to anticipate and counter the specific intelligence gathering methods that FOB Sentinel was using. Overwatch 2, this is Overwatch 3. Bennett's voice carried a new note of urgency. I've got multiple heat signatures moving through dead ground, approximately 600 meters east of my position. Count at least 4 individuals with equipment. That looks like sniper rifles. Overwatch 3, can you engage? Negative. They're using terrain masking, and I can't establish clear lines of sight. But they're definitely maneuvering toward positions that would provide overwatch of our base perimeter. Pierce's voice returned with the clipped authority of a commander making tactical decisions under pressure. All Overwatch elements, enemy forces are demonstrating professional counter-surveillance capabilities. Your mission parameters have changed from locate and destroy to observe and report. Do not engage unless you have overwhelming tactical advantage. Sophia. Listen to the tactical radio traffic with growing apprehension. Precision Team Bravo was encountering exactly the kind of professional opposition that her signal analysis had suggested, but conventional military tactics were proving inadequate. For dealing with adversaries who possessed comprehensive intelligence about their operations. Base Command, this is Overwatch 1. We've identified enemy observation positions, but they're maintaining distance and using terrain to prevent effective engagement. Current tactical situation favors enemy forces. Roger, Overwatch 1. What's your recommendation? Mitchell's response carried the frustration of a professional soldier confronting the limitations of conventional tactics. Ma'am, enemy forces are demonstrating operational capabilities that exceed standard insurgent profiles. They understand our tactics, they're anticipating our movements, and they're maintaining tactical initiative despite being outnumbered. Are you recommending mission abort? Ma'am, I'm recommending that we acknowledge we're dealing with professional adversaries who have been preparing for this engagement longer than we've been preparing to counter it. Conventional counter-sniper operations require tactical surprise, and we don't have it. The radio fell silent except for the static that seemed to carry the weight of tactical failure. 3 hours of professional military operations had produced intelligence about enemy capabilities, but no reduction in the threat they represented. If anything, the attempted counter-sniper operations had demonstrated that FUB Sentinel's adversaries possessed tactical sophistication that exceeded their defenders' ability to counter effectively. Sophia stared at her displays, watching radio traffic that showed enemy forces maintaining their positions while FOB Sentinel's elite personnel struggled with tactical problems that had no obvious solutions. The morning sun continued its climb. Toward noon, and somewhere in the mountains, professional adversaries were preparing for an operation that conventional military responses couldn't prevent. The question was no longer whether enemy snipers would demonstrate their capability, but whether anyone at FOB Sentinel could develop an unconventional response before it was too late. The emergency command briefing at 1300 hours felt like a military tribunal, with Sophia standing at the center of a room filled with frustrated officers who were looking for someone to blame for their tactical failures. The past 4 hours had demonstrated that conventional counter-sniper operations were ineffective against their current adversaries, and the weight of that failure was settling heavily on everyone involved in the planning process. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce stood at the front of the room, her expression grim as she reviewed after-action reports that painted a picture of professional embarrassment. Precision Team Bravo, FOB Sentinel's elite sniper unit, had been outmaneuvered by adversaries who seemed to anticipate their every move. The psychological impact of that failure was threatening to undermine confidence in the base's entire defensive capability. Gentlemen, Pierce began, her voice carrying the controlled tension of a commander dealing with an unprecedented tactical situation. We need to acknowledge that our current approach is not working. Enemy forces have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our intelligence estimates and tactical preparations. Sergeant Crane shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing that his initial dismissal of Sophia's intelligence had contributed to the current crisis. Ma'am, the intelligence provided by Staff Sergeant Blake was accurate regarding enemy presence, but it didn't include tactical capabilities that would have allowed us to develop more effective countermeasures. Sophia felt the familiar burn of unfair criticism, but before she could respond, Staff Sergeant Mitchell stood up with obvious frustration. Ma'am, the problem isn't intelligence, it's that we're dealing with professional military operators who understand our tactics as well as we do. Blake's signal analysis gave us locations, but it didn't tell us we were facing opponents with advanced counter-surveillance training. Actually, Sophia interjected, My analysis included assessments of communication discipline and operational security that indicated professional military training. Those assessments were included in my written reports. Sergeant Crane's face flushed with anger. Blake, your reports focused on radio traffic patterns. You didn't provide tactical intelligence about enemy capabilities or intentions. Sir, respectfully, communication discipline is a direct indicator of tactical capability. The patterns I identified clearly showed Martinez. Crane snapped, using the wrong name in his agitation. You're a communications specialist, not a tactical analyst. Your job is to provide technical intelligence, not operational assessments. The room erupted in uncomfortable silence. Sophia had spent 3 days providing comprehensive analysis that had accurately predicted enemy presence, coordination, and timing, only to be dismissed again when conventional tactics failed to address the threat she'd identified. Lieutenant Davis, clearly trying to diffuse the tension, spoke up from his position near the tactical display. The question is where we go from here. Enemy forces are maintaining their positions. Our counter-sniper operations have been ineffective, and we're approaching the timeline when they're expected to initiate their operation. Corporal Walsh, who had spent the morning observing enemy forces through his scope, added his perspective. Ma'am, these aren't ordinary insurgents. They're conducting textbook military operations with equipment and training that matches anything we've seen from professional units. Conventional tactics aren't going to work against opponents who understand those tactics as well as we do. Pierce nodded grimly. Then we need unconventional solutions. The question is whether we have personnel with the expertise to develop approaches that fall outside standard tactical doctrine. Sophia saw her opportunity and took it. Ma'am, I'd like to propose an alternative approach based on the intelligence patterns I've been tracking. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sergeant Crane turned toward her with barely controlled irritation. Blake, I think you've contributed enough intelligence for one operation. Let the tactical specialists handle operational planning. Sir, the patterns I've identified suggest vulnerabilities in enemy operational security that could be exploited using non-standard approaches. Blake, Mitchell interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of field experience. Signal analysis is valuable, but tactical operations require different expertise. We appreciate your intelligence work, but field operations need to be planned by people with combat experience. Sophia felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed based on assumptions about her background rather than evaluation of her actual capabilities. Sergeant, I have 18 months of field reconnaissance experience and advanced training in unconventional warfare tactics. Communications reconnaissance, Crane corrected dismissively. Technical intelligence gathering, not tactical field operations. Actually, sir, my background includes direct action missions with the 3rd Infantry Division Special Operations Detachment. I have experience with exactly the kind of unconventional approaches that might be effective against professional adversaries. The revelation hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Sophia's personnel file contained information that none of her current colleagues had bothered to review, and her calm assertion of special operations experience challenged every assumption they'd made about her capabilities. Private Bennett looked up from his notes with obvious curiosity. What kind of direct action experience? Before Sophia could respond, Sergeant Crane stood up with obvious irritation. Blake, I don't care what's in your personnel file. This is not the time for support staff to volunteer for combat operations. We need solutions from qualified personnel, not wishful thinking from people trying to prove themselves. The dismissal was so casual and complete that it took Sophia's breath away. 3 days of accurate intelligence, comprehensive analysis that had predicted every aspect of the current crisis, and professional recommendations based on legitimate military experience, all dismissed, because she was categorized as support staff in their minds. Sir, she said quietly, The enemy communication patterns suggest they're planning to initiate operations at approximately 1500 hours. That gives us less than 2 hours to develop effective countermeasures. Blake, Pierce interrupted, I appreciate your analysis, but operational planning needs to focus on proven tactics implemented by experienced personnel. Your intelligence contribution has been valuable, but tactical execution requires different expertise. Sophia looked around the room at the assembled officers and realized that nothing had changed. Despite the failure of conventional approaches, despite the accuracy of her intelligence, despite the professional capabilities she demonstrated, she was still just a support staff in their eyes. Her warnings would be noted, her analysis would be filed, and her tactical recommendations would be ignored while qualified personnel developed solutions using approaches that had already proven ineffective. Yes, ma'am, Sophia said quietly. I'll return to my communications duties. As she walked toward the exit, she could hear the tactical discussion resuming behind her. Voices rose in debate about defensive positioning, communication protocols, and emergency procedures, all focused on reactive measures that would allow enemy forces to demonstrate their capability before FOB Sentinel could respond effectively. Outside the command center, Sophia stood in the afternoon heat and looked up at the mountains surrounding FOB Sentinel. Somewhere in those peaks, professional adversaries were making final preparations for an operation that would transform the base from a secure installation into a psychological battleground. And despite possessing the intelligence and tactical expertise that might prevent that transformation, she had been dismissed and relegated to the sidelines once again. But Sophia Blake had not survived 18 months of special operations assignments by accepting dismissal when lives were at stake. The communication patterns she'd been analyzing told a story that went beyond simple sniper attacks, and her tactical experience suggested approaches that might neutralize the threat before it could be fully implemented. The question was whether she had the courage to act independently when her superiors had made it clear that her contributions were not wanted. The afternoon sun was climbing toward its peak. Enemy forces were preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would paralyze base operations, and time was running out for conventional solutions. Sometimes the most important decisions were made by people who refused to accept that they weren't qualified to make them. Alone in Building C with only the hum of electronic equipment for company, Sophia Blake stared at intelligence data that told a story her superiors refused to hear. The afternoon sun slanted through the single window, casting long shadows across banks of radio equipment that had become her window into enemy operations. What she saw in those radio patterns wasn't just preparation for a sniper attack, it was the signature of something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. She pulled up classified files that she wasn't supposed to access, using security credentials that should have been deactivated when she transferred to communications duties but somehow remained active in the system. The information she found confirmed her worst suspicions about the true nature of the threat facing FOB Sentinel. The enemy forces surrounding their position weren't regional insurgents, or even experienced fighters from neighboring conflicts. They were members of an elite unit that had been specifically trained to conduct psychological warfare operations against Western military installations. Their mission wasn't to inflict massive casualties, it was to demonstrate that even the most secure American bases could be effectively neutralized by professional adversaries who understood both conventional military tactics and the psychological vulnerabilities of isolated personnel. Sophia had encountered this particular signature before, during her deployment with the 3rd Infantry Division Special Operations Detachment. Operation Blackwater, 18 months earlier, had been a classified mission to neutralize exactly this type of psychological warfare unit operating in a different theater. The communication patterns, the tactical sophistication, the emphasis on operational security over direct confrontation, all of it matched intelligence profiles from that previous engagement. But Operation Blackwater had been classified at levels That prevented her from sharing specific details with her current command structure. Even if Sergeant Crane or Lieutenant Colonel Pierce had been willing to listen to her tactical recommendations, she couldn't provide the complete intelligence picture that would explain why conventional counter-sniper operations were doomed to fail against these particular adversaries. The truth was that psychological warfare units like the one surrounding FOB Sentinel were specifically trained to counter conventional military responses. They studied American tactical doctrine, practiced against simulated U.S. defensive positions, and developed techniques designed to exploit the predictable patterns of behavior that characterized professional military organizations. Every standard response that FOB Sentinel's leadership was considering defensive positioning, communication protocols, evacuation procedures had been anticipated and planned for by enemies who understood those responses as well as the Americans implementing them. The harder FOB Sentinel's personnel tried to follow established tactical doctrine, the more effectively their adversaries could manipulate and control their actions. Sophia opened her personal laptop and accessed files she had never expected to need again. Buried in encrypted folders were tactical assessments, operational reports, and psychological profiles from Operation Blackwater that provided detailed intelligence about exactly the kind of adversaries they were currently facing. The information was classified, sensitive, and absolutely critical for understanding how to effectively counter the threat. According to the Blackwater files, psychological warfare units operated on the principle of tactical patience. They would establish comprehensive surveillance of their targets, study behavioral patterns and defensive responses, then implement operations designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their own exposure to counterattack. Goal wasn't military victory in any conventional sense. It was the demonstration that conventional military superiority was irrelevant against adversaries who could control the psychological battlefield. The radio patterns Sophia had been tracking matched this profile exactly. The coordinated surveillance, the professional communication discipline, the sophisticated counterintelligence measures, all of it was consistent with a unit that had been specifically trained to neutralize Western military installations through psychological dominance rather than direct confrontation. But the Blackwater files also contained information that could neutralize this particular threat. During Operation Blackwater, Sophia's unit had developed unconventional tactics that exploited the psychological warfare unit's own operational security against them. By using approaches that fell outside standard military doctrine, they had been able to achieve tactical surprise against adversaries who thought they understood all possible American responses. The key was recognizing that psychological warfare units, despite their sophistication, operated according to predictable patterns of their own. Their emphasis on operational security and their confidence in their ability to anticipate conventional responses created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by unconventional approaches implemented by personnel willing to operate outside established tactical frameworks. Sophia studied the tactical assessment from Operation Blackwater, focusing on the specific techniques that had proven effective against professional psychological warfare units. The approach required a single operator working independently, using non-standard equipment, and implementing tactics that would appear random and unpredictable to adversaries accustomed to conventional military responses. The radio traffic patterns she had been monitoring showed that the enemy unit was preparing to initiate their operation within the next hour. Their communication discipline had shifted from surveillance coordination to operational implementation, and the timing suggested they were positioning for maximum psychological impact during FOB Sentinel's afternoon shift change when personnel movement would be most concentrated. But the same radio traffic that revealed their timeline also revealed their tactical weakness. The psychological warfare unit's emphasis on coordination and control meant they maintained constant communication between their various positions. That communication network, which they considered a tactical advantage, could become a critical vulnerability if attacked by someone who understood how to exploit their operational dependencies. Sophia closed the classified files and stared at the radio equipment surrounding her workstation. The solution to FOB Sentinel's tactical problem was sitting in front of her, not in the form of defensive measures or conventional counter-sniper operations, but in the form of an unconventional approach that would neutralize the enemy's psychological advantage by demonstrating capabilities they hadn't anticipated. The approach would require her to operate independently, using skills and knowledge that her current command structure didn't believe she possessed. It would mean taking tactical risks that could result in court-martial if the operation failed, and it would require her to trust 18 months of special operations experience against the conventional wisdom of officers who had dismissed her recommendations without consideration. Most importantly, it would require her to accept that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by personnel who refused to stay within the limitations that others had imposed on them. Sophia opened her personal equipment locker and began assembling gear that she hadn't touched since her transfer to communications duties. Her custom rifle, modified according to specifications developed during Operation Blackwater. Specialized optical equipment designed for high-altitude operations. Communication devices that operated on frequencies outside standard military networks. And most critically, tactical intelligence that could transform a defensive crisis into an offensive opportunity. The enemy units surrounding FOB Sentinel thought they understood all possible American responses to their operation. They had prepared for conventional tactics, anticipated standard defensive measures, and positioned themselves to control the psychological battlefield through demonstrated superiority over professional military personnel. What they hadn't prepared for was a single operator working outside the tactical framework they had spent months studying, using knowledge and capabilities that existed outside the conventional military structure they thought they understood completely. The afternoon sun was approaching its peak. Enemy forces were making final preparations for their psychological warfare operation, and time was running out for conventional solutions. But somewhere in the mountains around FOB Sentinel, there were vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone willing to operate according to rules that existed outside standard military doctrine. Sophia Blake checked the action on her rifle and prepared to demonstrate that sometimes the most important battles were won by people who refused to accept the limitations that others had imposed on their capabilities. At 14:30 hours, FOB Sentinel's defensive preparations reached a state of organized chaos. That would have been comical if the situation weren't so desperately serious. Sophia watched from Building C as personnel scrambled between hardened positions. Armored vehicles repositioned themselves according to hastily revised offensive plans, and officers shouted contradictory orders that reflected the fundamental confusion about how to respond to a threat that conventional tactics couldn't address. The radio traffic she monitored told a different story than the frantic activity visible through her window. Enemy communications had shifted to final operational coordination, with transmission patterns that indicated imminent action. The psychological warfare unit wasn't responding to FOB Sentinel's defensive preparations. They were proceeding according to a timeline that treated those preparations as irrelevant to their operational objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce's voice crackled through the command frequency with the controlled tension of a leader trying to maintain authority in an unprecedented situation. All stations, this is Base Command. Intelligence indicates enemy forces are preparing to initiate operations within the next 30 minutes. All personnel will maintain defensive positions and await further orders. Sophia studied her tactical display, watching real-time enemy communications that painted a comprehensive picture of coordinated action that FOB Sentinel's leadership still didn't fully understand. The psychological warfare unit wasn't planning a conventional sniper attack. They were implementing a demonstration of tactical superiority that would render the base psychologically indefensible regardless of physical casualties. 17 enemy positions had been precisely calculated to provide overlapping fields of observation and fire that would make normal base operations impossible. But more importantly, those positions had been selected to demonstrate that FOB Sentinel's defensive measures were fundamentally inadequate against adversaries who understood the psychological impact of tactical helplessness. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's voice cut through the radio chatter with professional frustration that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Base Command. This is Overwatch 1. Enemy forces are maintaining positions outside effective engagement range while conducting final preparations for coordinated action. Current defensive posture is not preventing enemy operational progress. Roger. Overwatch 1. What's your tactical assessment? Mitchell's response carried the weight of professional acknowledgement that conventional approaches had failed. Ma'am, enemy forces have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our current countermeasures. They're implementing an operation that our defensive preparations cannot effectively address. The implications of Mitchell's assessment settled over the command frequency like a heavy blanket. Precision Team Bravo, FOB Sentinel's elite tactical unit, was essentially admitting that they couldn't prevent enemy forces from achieving their operational objectives. The psychological impact of that admission was exactly what the psychological warfare unit had been working to achieve. Sophia pulled up the classified intelligence from Operation Blackwater and cross-referenced it with her current tactical analysis. The pattern was unmistakable. The enemy unit was implementing the same operational framework that had been successfully used against 3 other American installations over the past 18 months. Each previous operation had followed the same progression: comprehensive surveillance, tactical positioning, demonstration of defensive inadequacy, and psychological victory through proven tactical superiority. But the Blackwater files also contained detailed information about the one operation where this particular psychological warfare unit had been successfully countered. The key had been recognizing that their strength, comprehensive operational coordination, was also their critical vulnerability when attacked by approaches they hadn't anticipated. The enemy unit's communication network, which enabled their sophisticated coordination, also created dependencies that could be exploited by unconventional tactics. If their command and control structure could be disrupted at the moment of operational initiation, their coordinated demonstration would collapse into confusion and tactical failure. Sophia opened her equipment case and assembled the specialized rifle system she had used during Operation Blackwater. The weapon looked like standard military hardware to casual observation, but it incorporated modifications that had been specifically developed for operations against psychological warfare units. Extended range capability, specialized ammunition, designed for electronic disruption, and optical systems that could function effectively in the high-altitude environment surrounding FOB Sentinel. The radio crackled with Corporal Walsh's voice reporting new enemy activity. Base Command, this is Overwatch 2. I'm observing coordinated movement across multiple enemy positions. They're implementing final positioning for what appears to be simultaneous operations against base infrastructure. Overwatch 2, can you engage any of the observed targets? Negative, Base Command. Enemy forces are maintaining distance and using terrain to prevent effective engagement. Current tactical situation continues to favor enemy operations. Sophia checked her watch. 14:45 hours. According to the communication patterns she'd been tracking, the psychological warfare unit would initiate their demonstration in exactly 15 minutes. That timeline had been calculated to maximize the psychological impact of their operation while minimizing exposure to potential countermeasures. But their precise timing also created an opportunity for someone who understood their operational methodology, and possessed the capability to disrupt their coordination at the critical moment of implementation. The approach Sophia was considering would require her to operate independently outside the command structure that had repeatedly dismissed her recommendations. It would mean leaving the relative safety of Building C and positioning herself in terrain that would expose her to potential enemy observation. Most critically, it would require her to trust intelligence and tactical capabilities that her superiors believed she didn't possess. Pierce's voice returned to the command frequency with orders that reflected the fundamental helplessness of conventional military leadership confronting an unconventional threat. All stations, enemy forces are demonstrating tactical capabilities that exceed our current defensive measures. Implement Protocol 7. All non-essential personnel to hardened positions. Essential operations only. Prepare for potential evacuation procedures. Protocol 7 was essentially an admission of tactical defeat before the enemy had even initiated their operation. It represented the psychological victory that the warfare unit had been working to achieve, the demonstration that conventional American military superiority was irrelevant. Against adversaries who controlled the psychological battlefield, Sophia slung her rifle across her shoulder and gathered the specialized equipment she would need for an operation that existed outside any tactical doctrine her superiors would recognize. The communication analysis that had brought her to this moment showed enemy forces preparing to demonstrate their superiority over professional American military personnel through coordinated action that conventional responses couldn't prevent. But the same analysis also revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by unconventional approaches implemented by someone willing to operate according to tactical principles that the enemy unit hadn't studied or anticipated. The afternoon sun was reaching its peak. Enemy forces were positioned for coordinated demonstration of tactical superiority, and FOB Sentinel's leadership was implementing defensive measures that amounted to tactical surrender before the battle had even begun. But in Building C, surrounded by radio equipment that told stories her superiors refused to hear, Sophia Blake was preparing to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by personnel who refused to accept that conventional limitations applied to unconventional problems. The question was whether 18 months of special operations experience and intelligence that existed outside standard military frameworks would be sufficient to neutralize a threat that conventional approaches had proven incapable of addressing. In 10 minutes, she would find out whether courage and capability could overcome institutional dismissal and tactical orthodoxy. The mountains around FOB Sentinel were about to witness either the most spectacular military failure in recent history or the kind of independent action that redefined the boundaries of what was considered possible. At 1450 hours, while FOB Sentinel's leadership implemented defensive measures that amounted to tactical surrender, Sophia Blake slipped out of Building C carrying equipment that most of her colleagues didn't know she possessed. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the base perimeter as she moved with the practiced stealth of someone trained in operations that existed outside conventional military doctrine. Her destination was Position Alpha 7, a rocky outcrop approximately 800 meters northeast of the base perimeter that she had identified during her initial reconnaissance of FOB Sentinel's surroundings. The position offered clear lines of sight to 3 of the enemy communication nodes while remaining outside the observation zones that the psychological warfare unit had established for their operation. Moving across open ground while potentially under enemy observation required the kind of fieldcraft that came from 18 months of special operations experience. Sophia used terrain features, building shadows, and the natural dead space created by FOB Sentinel's defensive barriers to remain invisible to adversaries who thought they had comprehensive surveillance of all approaches to tactical positions. Specialized rifle system she carried had been modified according to specifications, developed during Operation Blackwater for exactly this type of mission. The weapon incorporated extended range capabilities that would allow engagement of targets at distances that exceeded standard military expectations. But more importantly, it had been configured for precision disruption of electronic communication networks rather than conventional anti-personnel operations. As she moved through the desert scrub that surrounded Forward Sentinel, Sophia's earpiece crackled with radio traffic that painted a real-time picture of enemy coordination reaching its final phase. The psychological warfare unit was implementing precise timing that would maximize the impact of their demonstration while minimizing exposure to potential countermeasures. Network primary, this is Observation 7, came a transmission on the frequency she had been monitoring. Final positioning complete. All elements report ready for operational initiation. Roger, Observation 7. Initiate Phase 1 in 8 minutes, 30 seconds. Maintain communication discipline until operational completion. Sophia reached position Alpha 7 with 6 minutes to spare, immediately beginning the equipment setup that would determine whether her unconventional approach could neutralize a threat that conventional tactics had proven incapable of addressing. The rocky outcrop provided natural concealment while offering clear sight lines to the 3 communication nodes that served as coordination hubs for the enemy operation. Through her specialized optical system, she could observe enemy positions that had remained invisible to conventional reconnaissance efforts. The psychological warfare unit had positioned themselves with tactical sophistication that reflected professional military training, but their emphasis on coordination and control had created the exact vulnerabilities that Operation Blackwater had taught her to exploit. The enemy communication network operated on a hub-and-spoke model, with 3 primary nodes coordinating operational elements distributed across 17 positions. Conventional counter-sniper operations had focused on individual positions, which the enemy could easily abandon and re-establish. But the communication nodes represented critical infrastructure that couldn't be relocated without compromising the entire operation. Sophia assembled her rifle with the mechanical precision of someone whose life had depended on equipment reliability during operations that allowed no margin for error. The weapon's extended range capability would allow her to engage all 3 communication nodes in rapid succession, but the specialized ammunition she was using required precise targeting to achieve electronic disruption rather than physical destruction. Network primary, this is Observation 12. Another transmission revealed enemy forces making final preparations. Psychological demonstration targets have been identified and prioritized. Estimated impact timeline proceeds according to operational parameters. Roger, Observation 12. Phase 1 initiation in 4 minutes, 15 seconds. All elements maintain current positioning until coordination signal. Sophia adjusted her optical system and began calculating range, wind speed, and atmospheric conditions that would affect precision engagement at extreme distance. The first target was Communication Node Alpha, positioned on a ridge approximately 1,200 meters to her northeast. The second target, Node Bravo, was located 1,350 meters to her north. The third target, Node Charlie, was positioned 1,180 meters to her northwest. Engaging all 3 targets would require her to demonstrate marksmanship capabilities that exceeded standard military expectations while implementing tactical knowledge that existed outside conventional training programs. The approach demanded absolute precision under conditions that allowed no opportunity for correction or second attempts. Her earpiece crackled with the final enemy coordination signal. All stations, this is Network primary. Phase 1 initiation in 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Implement psychological demonstration according to operational timeline. Maintain communication discipline until mission completion confirmation. Sophia settled into firing position with the calm focus that came from special operations, training that had prepared her for exactly this type of independent action. Through her scope, she could observe the first communication node, a sophisticated radio, set up positioned among rocks that provided natural camouflage while maintaining clear transmission paths to subordinate elements. The enemy operators were professionals, but their tactical sophistication had created predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone who understood how psychological warfare units operated under pressure. Their emphasis on coordination meant they would implement their demonstration according to precise timing that left no flexibility for unexpected complications. Network primary. This is Observation 7. All elements report final readiness. Psychological demonstration targets are identified and prioritized according to maximum impact parameters. Roger, all stations. Phase 1 initiation in 60 seconds. Implement coordinated demonstration of tactical superiority. Show these Americans that their conventional defenses are irrelevant against professional adversaries. Sophia took a deep breath and settled her crosshairs on communication. Node Alpha. The next 60 seconds would determine whether 18 months of special operations experience and intelligence that existed outside standard military frameworks could neutralize a threat that conventional approaches had proven incapable of addressing. Her finger found the trigger as enemy forces prepared to demonstrate their superiority over professional American military personnel. But they had made one critical miscalculation in their operational planning. They had assumed that all American responses would follow conventional tactical doctrine, implemented by personnel operating within established command structures. What they hadn't anticipated was a single operator working independently, using knowledge and capabilities that existed outside the tactical framework they had spent months studying, implementing an approach that their sophisticated preparation had never considered. Phase 1 initiation in 30 seconds. Came the final enemy transmission. Sophia Blake adjusted her aim and prepared to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by personnel who refused to accept the limitations that conventional thinking imposed on unconventional problems. The mountains around Forward Sentinel were about to witness the kind of precision, marksmanship that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was tactically possible. When expertise met opportunity under conditions that demanded absolute perfection. In 20 seconds, the psychological warfare unit would discover that their months of preparation had failed to account for the one variable that could neutralize their entire operation. A professional who refused to stay within the boundaries that others had defined for her capabilities. At exactly 1500 hours, as enemy forces initiated their coordinated psychological demonstration, Sophia Blake achieved something that would be discussed in military circles for decades to come, a precision engagement that redefined the theoretical limits of long-range marksmanship while simultaneously neutralizing a threat that conventional tactics had proven incapable of addressing. The first shot struck communication node Alpha at 1,247 meters, the specialized ammunition creating an electromagnetic pulse that instantly disabled the sophisticated radio equipment coordinating enemy forces in the northeastern sector. The electronic disruption cascaded through their communication network like a digital virus, severing the coordination links that the psychological warfare unit considered essential for operational success. But Sophia didn't pause to observe the effects of her first engagement. The tactical window for this operation measured in seconds, not minutes, and the success of her unconventional approach depended on achieving complete disruption of enemy coordination before they could adapt to unexpected complications. Her second shot engaged communication node Bravo at 1,367 meters, the longest precision engagement of her career, striking the radio array with mathematical precision that reflected 18 Months of special operations training applied under conditions that demanded absolute perfection. The electromagnetic pulse from the specialized ammunition created a secondary explosion as stored power cells overloaded, sending a brilliant flash across the mountainside that was visible even from FOB Sentinel's perimeter. Through her scope, Sophia could observe the immediate effects of communication, disruption rippling through enemy positions like shock waves from an earthquake. Professional military operators who had been implementing coordinated tactical movements suddenly found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate with adjacent elements, uncertain whether their carefully planned operation was proceeding according to schedule or collapsing into chaos. The third shot, targeting communication node Charlie at 1,194 meters, completed the triangle of electronic warfare that transformed the psychological warfare unit's greatest strength into their critical vulnerability. The coordinated command structure that had enabled their sophisticated operation became a liability when the communication links that held it together were severed by precision engagement that they had never anticipated. But the true genius of Sophia's approach became apparent in the moments following her third shot. The electromagnetic pulses from her specialized ammunition hadn't just disabled enemy communication equipment. They had created cascading failures in electronic systems throughout the enemy network, effectively blinding and deafening adversaries who had been implementing an operation that required comprehensive situational awareness. From her position at Alpha 7, Sophia watched through her optical system as enemy personnel emerged from concealed positions, attempting to restore communication links or establish visual contact with elements that had suddenly become unreachable. The psychological warfare unit, which had spent months preparing to demonstrate tactical superiority over American forces, was experiencing the kind of confusion and coordination failure that they had intended to inflict on their targets. Network primary, this is observation 7, came a panicked transmission on backup frequencies that the electromagnetic disruption hadn't affected. Primary communication network is down, unable to establish contact with coordination elements. Request guidance for operational continuation. Silence answered the desperate call. Network primary, the command element coordinating the entire psychological demonstration, had been positioned near communication node Alpha and was experiencing complete electronic isolation that prevented them from providing guidance to subordinate elements, suddenly operating without coordination or clear understanding of the tactical situation. All stations, this is observation 12. Another voice attempted to restore operational control. Primary network is compromised. Implement contingency protocols for independent operation. But contingency protocols designed for communication failure couldn't address the comprehensive electronic disruption that Sophia's specialized ammunition had created throughout their operational area. The psychological warfare unit had prepared for equipment failure, personnel casualties, even discovery by conventional counter-sniper operations, but they had never anticipated electronic warfare, conducted by a single operator using capabilities that existed outside standard military frameworks. Through her earpiece, Sophia could hear confused transmissions from enemy elements trying to understand what had happened to their sophisticated coordination network. Professional military operators who had been implementing textbook psychological warfare operations were experiencing the kind of tactical confusion that made coordinated action impossible. Observation 7. This is observation 15. I've lost contact with all coordination elements, unable to determine operational status or receive guidance for continuation. Request instructions for emergency withdrawal procedures. The request for withdrawal procedures revealed the complete collapse of operational confidence that Sophia's unconventional approach had achieved. The psychological warfare unit, which had positioned themselves to demonstrate American tactical inadequacy, was now experiencing the kind of coordination failure that made their own operation impossible to continue. From FOB Sentinel's command center, radio operators were detecting the dramatic change in enemy communication patterns. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce's voice crackled through Sophia's earpiece as base leadership tried to understand what had caused the sudden transformation of their tactical situation. All stations, this is base command. We're detecting significant disruption in enemy communication networks. All enemy coordination appears to have ceased. Request immediate reconnaissance to determine enemy status and intentions. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's voice responded with professional bewilderment. Base command, this is Overwatch 1. Enemy positions that were active 5 minutes ago are showing signs of withdrawal and confusion. I'm observing personnel abandoning prepared positions without apparent coordination or tactical purpose. Through her scope, Sophia could confirm Mitchell's observations. Enemy forces who had been implementing coordinated preparation for psychological demonstration were now conducting hasty withdrawal from positions they had occupied for days. The confidence and tactical sophistication that had characterized their operation had been replaced by confusion and apparent panic. Overwatch 1, can you identify the cause of enemy disruption? Mitchell's response carried the tone of someone trying to explain tactical developments that exceeded his understanding. Negative, base command. Enemy forces appear to have experienced comprehensive communication failure that's preventing coordinated operations. The tactical situation has completely reversed in the past 5 minutes. Sophia began disassembling her rifle system with the methodical precision of someone who had completed a mission that exceeded even her own expectations for tactical success. The specialized ammunition had achieved electronic disruption beyond theoretical parameters, creating cascading failures that had transformed a sophisticated enemy operation into tactical chaos. As she prepared to return to FOB Sentinel, Sophia could hear continued enemy transmissions on backup frequencies, revealing the complete collapse of operational coordination that her unconventional approach had achieved. All stations, this is emergency coordination. Primary operation is aborted. Implement immediate withdrawal to rally points according to contingency protocols. Operational timeline is no longer viable. The psychological warfare unit that had positioned themselves to demonstrate tactical superiority over American forces was conducting emergency withdrawal from an operation that had been neutralized by capabilities they had never studied, anticipated, or prepared to counter. In the space of 3 precision shots lasting less than 2 minutes, Sophia Blake had transformed what appeared to be inevitable tactical defeat into comprehensive operational victory. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by personnel who refused to accept that conventional limitations applied to unconventional problems. The mountains around FOB Sentinel had witnessed exactly the kind of independent action that redefined the boundaries of tactical possibility when expertise met opportunity under conditions that demanded absolute perfection. Sophia Blake's return to FOB Sentinel at 15:30 hours created a scene that would be remembered by every witness for the rest of their military careers. As she walked through the base perimeter carrying equipment that most personnel didn't recognize, the entire installation was buzzing with confused activity as officers tried to understand how a catastrophic tactical situation had transformed into complete operational victory in the space of 15 minutes. The command center had become a hub of frantic radio traffic as reconnaissance teams reported the continuing withdrawal of enemy forces from positions they had occupied for days. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce stood at the center of it all, studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of tactical success that exceeded her most optimistic projections, but for reasons that no one could adequately explain. Base command. This is Overwatch 2. Corporal Walsh's voice crackled through the speakers with professional bewilderment. Enemy Position 7 is completely abandoned. I'm observing equipment caches that appear to have been hastily evacuated, with communication gear left behind in non-functional condition. Roger, Overwatch 2. What's the condition of the equipment? Ma'am, it looks like some kind of electronic failure. Sophisticated radio gear that appears to have suffered catastrophic overload. I've never seen anything like it. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's voice joined the tactical conversation with observations that added to the growing mystery. Base Command. This is Overwatch 1. I'm tracking multiple enemy elements conducting withdrawal movements without apparent coordination. They're moving like units that have lost command and control capability. Sophia entered Building C and began securing her specialized equipment while listening to radio traffic that confirmed the complete success of her unconventional operation. The psychological warfare unit that had positioned themselves to demonstrate tactical superiority was conducting exactly the kind of confused withdrawal that characterized military units whose coordination had been comprehensively disrupted. Sergeant Crane's voice cut through the radio chatter with barely controlled confusion. All reconnaissance elements, this is base operations. I want immediate reports on any evidence of what caused this enemy withdrawal. We need to understand what changed the tactical situation. Sophia almost smiled at the irony of Crane demanding explanations for tactical developments that he had specifically refused to consider when she had attempted to brief him on unconventional approaches to the enemy threat. The man who had dismissed her as just support staff was now desperately seeking answers that existed outside the conventional tactical framework he understood. Private Bennett's transmission added another piece to the puzzle that base leadership was struggling to solve. Base Command, this is Overwatch 3. I'm observing what appears to be electromagnetic damage to enemy communication equipment at Position 12. The gear shows signs of pulse overload that disabled multiple systems simultaneously. Overwatch 3. Can you identify the source of electromagnetic disruption? Negative, Base Command. The damage pattern suggests precision targeting of communication nodes, but I can't identify any friendly assets that could have achieved this kind of electronic warfare effect. Through the window of Building C, Sophia could see vehicles racing between command positions as officers attempted to coordinate reconnaissance efforts that might explain their unexpected tactical victory. The same personnel who had spent the morning implementing defensive measures that amounted to tactical surrender were now trying to understand how comprehensive defeat had been transformed into operational success. Lieutenant Davis's voice joined the confused radio traffic with observations that revealed the scope of enemy operational failure. Base Command, this is Mobile Reconnaissance. Enemy forces appear to be conducting emergency withdrawal from all observed positions. Movement patterns suggest loss of centralized coordination and tactical confusion. Mobile Reconnaissance, are you observing any continuing enemy capabilities? Negative, Base Command. Enemy forces appear to be prioritizing withdrawal over any continuing operational activity. Whatever caused their communication failure has effectively ended their capability to conduct coordinated operations. Sophia secured her rifle in its case and began documenting her operation in a mission report. That would eventually become classified reading for military personnel studying unconventional approaches to electronic warfare. The technical details of her specialized ammunition and the tactical methodology she had employed represented capabilities that existed outside standard military doctrine, but the results spoke for themselves. The door to Building C opened, and Staff Sergeant Mitchell entered with the expression of someone trying to reconcile observed tactical results with his understanding of what should have been possible under the circumstances. Tom Mitchell was a professional soldier with enough experience to recognize exceptional marksmanship when he encountered it, and the evidence from the field suggested capabilities that exceeded standard military expectations. "Blake," he said, studying her with new attention, I just returned from observing enemy positions that show signs of precision engagement at ranges that exceed standard sniper capabilities. The electromagnetic damage patterns suggest specialized ammunition and targeting methodology that I've never encountered in conventional operations. Sophia looked up from her mission report with the calm expression of someone who had completed exactly the kind of operation she had been trained to conduct. The enemy communication network was vulnerable to electronic disruption if engaged. With appropriate equipment and tactical methodology, Blake, what I observed in the field suggests precision engagement at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters, using ammunition that could disable sophisticated electronic equipment. That kind of capability requires specialized training and equipment that goes beyond standard military sniper operations. Mitchell's assessment was accurate, but Sophia could see the confusion in his expression as he tried to reconcile his assumptions about her capabilities with evidence that suggested expertise he hadn't recognized. The same professional who had dismissed her tactical recommendations that morning was now confronting proof that she possessed capabilities that exceeded his own experience. "Sergeant," Sophia said quietly, "the enemy operation was neutralized using approaches that existed outside their operational planning assumptions. Sometimes unconventional problems require unconventional solutions." Before Mitchell could respond, the radio crackled with Lieutenant Colonel Pierce's voice, calling for an immediate briefing on tactical developments that had transformed FOB Sentinel's defensive crisis into comprehensive operational victory. "All senior personnel to the command center immediately. I want explanations for enemy withdrawal and identification of whatever caused their communication failure. Someone achieved tactical results that exceeded our most optimistic projections, and I want to know how." Mitchell looked at Sophia with dawning recognition that the woman he had dismissed as a communications specialist might possess exactly the kind of unconventional capabilities that Pierce was trying to identify. "Blake, you need to be in that briefing." "I'll be there, Sergeant. I have a complete mission report documenting the operation that neutralized enemy coordination capabilities." As they walked toward the command center, Sophia could feel the fundamental shift in atmosphere that accompanied recognition of capabilities that had been systematically underestimated. The same personnel who had spent days dismissing her recommendations were about to confront evidence that their assumptions about her expertise had been completely incorrect. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and FOB Sentinel was experiencing the kind of tactical victory that redefined everyone's understanding of what was possible when unconventional expertise met operational necessity under conditions that demanded absolute precision. But the most important transformation wasn't tactical, it was the recognition that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by personnel whose capabilities existed outside the conventional frameworks that others used to define professional competence. The emergency briefing at 1600 hours transformed the command center into something resembling a military tribunal in reverse. Instead of prosecuting failure, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce was trying to understand success that exceeded every tactical projection her staff had developed. Sophia entered the converted shipping container, carrying a comprehensive mission report that would eventually be studied at the highest levels of military command. But her immediate audience consisted of officers who were struggling to reconcile observed results with their assumptions about what should have been possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pierce began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 minutes reviewing intelligence reports that challenged fundamental assumptions about tactical capability. "We need to understand how a defensive crisis that threatened the operational viability of this installation was transformed into comprehensive victory in less than 20 minutes. The assembled personnel, Sergeant Crane, Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Corporal Walsh, Private Bennett, and Lieutenant Davis, represented the tactical leadership that had spent the morning implementing defensive measures while dismissing unconventional approaches as impractical. Now they sat in silence, waiting for explanations of tactical success that none of them had anticipated or contributed to achieving. Pierce clicked to her first slide, which showed real-time intelligence tracking enemy withdrawal from positions they had occupied for days. Reconnaissance reports indicate complete abandonment of 17 enemy positions, with evidence of catastrophic communication equipment failure that rendered coordinated operations impossible. She clicked to the next slide, displaying technical analysis of damaged enemy equipment that had been recovered from abandoned positions. Preliminary examination suggests precision electromagnetic pulse weapons were used to disable sophisticated radio gear at multiple locations simultaneously. The targeting accuracy and technical sophistication required for this operation exceeds standard military capabilities. Sergeant Crane shifted uncomfortably in his seat, apparently beginning to understand that his dismissal of Sophia's tactical recommendations might have prevented earlier implementation of the operation that had saved Forward Sentinel from psychological warfare demonstration. Furthermore, Pierce continued, the tactical methodology employed suggests intimate knowledge of enemy operational vulnerabilities and access to specialized equipment that exists outside standard military supply channels. Someone at this installation possessed capabilities that none of us recognized or utilized effectively. Staff Sergeant Mitchell cleared his throat. Ma'am, based on field observation of enemy positions, the precision engagement required for this operation would have demanded marksmanship capabilities at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters, using specialized ammunition designed for electronic warfare rather than conventional anti-personnel operations. Correct, Sergeant. Which brings us to the question of who at Forward Sentinel possessed the expertise, equipment, and tactical knowledge necessary to achieve these results. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that everyone in the room was beginning to understand. The tactical success they were analyzing had been achieved by someone whose capabilities they had systematically underestimated, using approaches they had dismissed as impractical, implementing solutions they had refused to consider. Sophia stood up from her position in the back of the room, her mission report in hand. Ma'am, I conducted the operation that neutralized enemy coordination capabilities, using specialized equipment and tactical methodology developed during previous classified assignments. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Sergeant Crane's face went pale as he realized that the support staff he had dismissed and ridiculed had single-handedly achieved tactical results that his conventional approaches had proven incapable of addressing. Lieutenant Davis looked like he was trying to process information that challenged every assumption he had made about tactical capability and professional competence. Pierce studied Sophia with the intense focus of a commander recognizing capabilities that had been completely underutilized. Staff Sergeant Blake, please brief us on the operation you conducted. Sophia moved to the front of the room with the confidence of someone presenting analysis that would stand up to any level of professional scrutiny. Ma'am, enemy forces were conducting coordinated psychological warfare operations using a communication network that enabled sophisticated tactical coordination while maintaining operational security against conventional countermeasures. She pulled up her tactical analysis, showing the hub-and-spoke communication structure that had enabled enemy coordination. The operation I conducted targeted 3 critical communication nodes using specialized electromagnetic pulse ammunition at ranges between 1,194 and 1,367 meters, creating cascading failures that disabled their entire coordination network. Staff Sergeant Mitchell leaned forward with obvious professional interest. Blake, that kind of precision engagement at extreme range using specialized ammunition requires training and equipment that goes far beyond standard military qualifications. Correct, Sergeant. The operation utilized capabilities developed during 18 months of classified assignments with special operations units conducting electronic warfare against professional adversaries. Pierce's expression showed recognition of implications that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Staff Sergeant Blake, your personnel file indicates communication specialization. Why wasn't your special operations background included in your current assignment profile? Sophia glanced at Sergeant Crane before responding. Ma'am, my special operations qualifications were considered irrelevant to communication support duties. My tactical recommendations and operational assessments were dismissed as outside my area of expertise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Pierce realized that critical military capabilities had been ignored and underutilized because of assumptions about professional competence that had nothing to do with actual qualifications or demonstrated expertise. Sergeant Crane, Pierce said, her voice carrying the deadly quiet of command authority recognizing systematic failure. Can you explain why specialized military capabilities were relegated to routine maintenance duties? Crane looked like he was trying to find words for decisions that now appeared professionally indefensible. Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Blake was assigned to communications duties, and I felt that her technical expertise was most valuable in that capacity. You felt that someone with special operations experience and advanced tactical qualifications should be limited to radio maintenance rather than contributing to operational planning and threat assessment. The question hung in the air like an indictment. Everyone in the room understood that systematic dismissal of qualified personnel had nearly resulted in tactical disaster, prevented only by independent action that achieved results exceeding their most optimistic projections. Pierce turned back to Sophia. Staff Sergeant Blake, effective immediately, you are reassigned to tactical operations with authority for electronic warfare and unconventional threat assessment. Furthermore, I am recommending you for promotion to Sergeant First Class, an assignment as Senior Tactical Specialist for this installation. She paused and looked around the room at assembled personnel who were processing the implications of recognizing capabilities they had failed to utilize effectively. Additionally, I am implementing comprehensive review of personnel utilization to ensure that we are maximizing rather than wasting the expertise available to this command. Corporal Walsh, who had spent the morning making jokes about support staff, spoke up with obvious embarrassment. Ma'am, I want to acknowledge that Staff Sergeant Blake's tactical contribution exceeded anything that our conventional approaches achieved. Her operation single-handedly neutralized a threat that our standard procedures couldn't address. Private Bennett nodded in agreement. Ma'am, the precision marksmanship and tactical innovation that Staff Sergeant Blake demonstrated represents exactly the kind of unconventional capability that modern warfare requires. Pierce smiled for the first time during the briefing. Gentlemen, I think we have all learned something important about the difference between assumed competence and demonstrated capability. Staff Sergeant Blake has shown us that sometimes the most effective military operations are conducted by personnel who refuse to accept limitations that others have imposed on their professional contributions. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out of the command center, Sophia felt the fundamental transformation in her professional status that came with recognition of capabilities that had been systematically underestimated. She was no longer just support staff relegated to routine duties. She was a tactical specialist whose expertise had proven essential for addressing threats that conventional approaches couldn't handle. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and FOB Sentinel was experiencing the kind of organizational transformation that occurred when professional assumptions were challenged by demonstrated results that exceeded every expectation. But most importantly, the base had learned that sometimes the most valuable military assets were people whose capabilities existed outside the conventional frameworks that others use to define professional competence. And sometimes those people had to prove their worth by achieving the impossible when everyone else said it couldn't be done. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.